This mini lecture is going to be dealing with how nested records work. Now, to have a nested record, obviously we're going to have to use a regular record. So if we consider a point in with two dimensions, we can have an x colon integer and a y colon integer, and this represents a 2D point in that particular mathematical world. Now, a line can be a record that is made up of a starting point and an ending point. Now, obviously I can't use end because it's a reserved word in Ada. However, I can use start P and end P that are both points. So now if I want to have a variable, say, we'll call it line 1 of type line, then I can say line 1 dot start point dot x equals 3, line 2 dot start point dot x equals 4, and 1 dot endpoint dot y colon equals say 5, and line 2 dot endpoint dot y will say equals 6. So here are two particular lines put together, and then we can obviously output the coordinates for a line. And then we can go through and access the last point, and that should print out 3, 4 if syntax is correct. So let's do a gnet make, also if it's in the path. So obviously I forgot to add in that as a variable. And forgot to turn that into a string. So I have a 3 and then a 9, 3, 4, 3. And that's because I only specified the x location for the first variable I just specified the y location for that. So this is an error of forgetting for the starting point of this. Now if we wanted to go on, we can go through and add in extra lines for this. Now, obviously this is rather unwieldy, so it would probably be better if we added in a procedure for, say, input line that would take a variable of type line, and this would be in specifically an output parameter. And then we could specify such as enter and then we could get var dot start point dot x, and we would repeat this for the rest of the inputs. So then that would make it much easier. So down here in main, we could just say, well, I want to input a line, so I'm going to say input line, and we'll say line 1. And that would then store all the information in it for us. Now remember, if your variables are before a procedure, that means they can be used in a global manner. So you always need to make sure your variables are stored right before they begin for this. So really the point of this is to demonstrate the fact that we can use records inside of records, in other words nested records, and sometimes when we're dealing with lots of information, it helps to break it into separate procedures for handling that information. Now, you may be thinking, why in the world is it necessary to go through and to try to build up points, lines? Well, if you've ever played a 2D board game and dealt with a grid pattern, well, a grid is made up of many lines. So a grid is really a record that holds several lines. So this could be, if we were going to have vertical and horizontal lines, we could have vertical, and we would have horizontal. Now obviously the line array doesn't exist yet, so we're going to have to say type line array is array, and then we'll say natural range. So then this would allow us to keep track of the vertical and horizontal lines on a particular grid, and if we had a graphical package, we could use the X and Y locations to correspond to places on the screen where we could draw lines. You could also add in, depending on your software, say a particular color of red, green, blue, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, Ada doesn't provide this by default. However, if you're working with a particular platform, being able to go through and specify, well, what is a point? In this case, it's two-dimensional, making up a line, and then being able to have several lines contained in a grid. It's a nice way to structure information, and that's a lot easier than just saying, well, I'm going to have an array of, say, 1,000 integers, and then I'm going to write some interesting complicated code to figure out how I can pull all that information and structure it into points and lines, so on and so forth. It makes a lot more sense to define these specific types and build up abstractions that match the particular domain that we're trying to come up with. So this is an example that deals with nested records and specifically how they can be built up and applied for a couple different pieces and looking at adding in procedures to help with that particular problem.